Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event on religious and conservative movements and fake news. In this conversation, we will be discussing one of the most pressing challenges to liberal democracy in the 21st century. On the one hand, we have a transnational movement of people who are fighting to restrict liberal rights for groups in society, such as women, LGBT, the disabled, and minorities. On the other hand, fake news and hate speech is flourishing in social media, and the spread of misinformation and hate is becoming a big threat to public discourse and collective meaning formation. How are these transnational organizations operating? How is it possible that fake news spread so unrestricted? And how do we deal with these challenges? These are some of the questions that the panel will answer in this event today. My name is Mathea Loen. I am a PhD candidate at the Centre for Research on Discretion and Paternalism at the University of Bergen, and I'm part of the research project Legitimacy Challenges. I will be moderating this event today, and now I am delighted to introduce to you the panel for this conversation. First, we have Neil Datta on the far left. Neil has from where I'm sitting right now.
You're far right.
Neil has a master's degree in European Public Administration from the College of Europe in Bruges, and a bachelor's in History and Languages from the State University of New York at Binghamton. In 2000, he founded the European Parliament Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights and has been the secretary of EPF since 2004. EPF is a network of members of parliaments from across Europe who are committed to protecting the sexual and reproductive health of the world's most vulnerable people. Neil has recently published 3 very interesting reports on these conservative and religious transnational movements: Restoring the Natural Order from 2008, Modern Day Crusaders in Europe from 2020, and Tip of the Iceberg, Religious Extremists, Funders Against Human Rights for Sexual and Reproductive Health in Europe. Next, we have Asgeir Falch-Eriksen. Asgeir is a political scientist, and his main research areas include political theory, trust theory, public administration, epistocracy, politics of families, and child protection. He's a senior researcher at the Centre for Welfare and Labour Research at the Oslo Metropolitan University, and Associate Professor 2 at the Centre for Research on Discretion and Paternalism at the University of Bergen. Asgeir has published several book chapters and articles, and he is the PI of the research project Consent, Cosmopolitan Turn, and Democratic Sentiments with partners in Romania. Finally, we have Lisa Maria Selvik. Lisa Maria is a PhD candidate at the University of Bergen. She's a political scientist. She holds a master's degree in political science and a bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Oslo. Her research focuses on contentious processes of advocacy on freedom of information laws in Africa, and she is part of the Breaking Bad Backlash Against Democracy in Africa project at CMI and the University of Bergen. She recently contributed to a special issue on autocratization in Africa in the journal Global Policy, and her article, which today's presentation is based on, was recently accepted, pending minor reviews, in Information Communication and Society. So I will first give the word to Neil, who will give an introduction based on the recent report from the EPF on religious extremist funders against human rights for sexuality and reproductive health. This report takes a deep dive into the funding of anti-gender groups in Europe. Then we will have a presentation from Asgeir and Lisa Maria as well. And then we will open up for questions. So for those of you who are following us on Zoom, feel free to post your questions in the chat or the Q&A function. And for those in the physical audience, you will also get a chance to ask your questions. Okay, Neil, The word is yours.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the introduction. I have a PowerPoint, which, okay, great. Okay, it's up there. So first I want to say that just a few things to preface the PowerPoint presentation. As Mathea pointed out, I work in an organization committed to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights. So I'm not an academic or a researcher. I'm very much a protagonist in the contestations around sexual and reproductive health and rights. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Second thing, I'll skip a little bit what I had intended to do about presenting anti-gender mobilization, and that's because it was done so elegantly by Ruth Rubio on the first day. And so I'm assuming everyone has been able to listen to that presentation and understands what anti-gender contestation and mobilization is about. And you will have heard a number of the names that I'll be saying throughout this presentation, such as Ordo Juris, Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, or Citizen Go, or something like this. So what I've decided to do with in this third report of mine is to take a look at the funding flows regarding anti-gender organizations in Europe. The reason for this is that on the one hand, there's the funding was assumed to be a great mystery. Being part of the progressive groups myself, the funding into the anti-gender groups was always described as monumental, phenomenal, they have more money than us, etc. And we just didn't know that. Separately, what research was done about the funding flows was very US-centric. So that, and for several reasons for that, partly because the information from the US is just so easy to get, whereas the information from other parts of Europe is much more difficult to get. So there's a methodological bias in there. So I wanted to see what, if we gather together all the information about this, what does it say? And so it's a way of understanding the anti-gender movement by looking at it from one specific angle, but there's many other angles by which you can take a look at it. Okay, so I'll start now. Okay, so first, the report we released earlier this year, just in mid-June, and it's structured into three parts: the geographic origins of where the funding comes from, how the funding is raised, and then how it all fits together through a number of case studies. And now first, just a few words about methodology in terms of what constitutes anti-gender and which organizations are included within this pool. So by anti-gender, I mean those organizations within civil society or legal entities which contest sexual reproductive health and rights, so abortion, contraception, etc. Those who contest LGBTQI rights, those who contest the notion of gender, so gender studies, the Istanbul Convention, gender-based violence law, children's rights, and then also certain liberties and freedoms under religious freedom. If we're able to identify a certain group of those, they belong to certain networks. I had identified about 120, and then you simply take a look at their financial details. So from 120, there's 54 for which there's relatively good financial details. So again, tip of the iceberg, it's barely half of the organizations that I wanted to take a look at. Then we examine their governance structures, and then what does the media and academic literature say about them and their connections, who are they overtly connected to? And I've covered the 2009 to 2018 period. So that's, when I talk about funding flows, it's always within that period. So first, overall findings is that we can account for over $700 million in this period coming from these 54 organizations. Three main geographic sources: United States, accounting for over 80 million, Russian Federation, 188 million, and Europe itself, 430 million. So already the American bias shows that it's a flawed perspective, that the US organizations are important, but they're not the determining factor here. What we see over a 10-year period is that there's a fourfold increase over this period in funding. And so there's a net increase in funding. And I think many of you have handled budgets before. If over a 10-year period, your budget increases by 4, you can do a lot more than 10 years ago. So also, the dialog box is hiding this, but you can see a big spike in 2013, 2014. That is the arrival of the Russian actors plus their departure following the sanctions from Western countries. So that accounts for this spike. If we take a look first at the Christian actors, would there be a way of, if I'm hiding that dialog box, okay, thanks. If we take a look first at the US actors, we can identify 10 NGOs and think tanks who are active in Europe. Okay, a number of them have established an infrastructure on the European continent with proper offices, and they're seeking accreditation in the human rights bodies present in Europe. Also, as I'll show, they're linked to the mega donors, to the big donors of the Republican Party. So you can see it's gone up and down, but it's remained at a relatively high level over the 10-year period. Here's a closer look at how the funding from the US comes over into Europe. So you have here on the far right of the screen, you have the end recipients in Europe, those specific US organizations. Alliance Defending Freedom, European Centre for Law and Justice, and a number of others. You go further up, they get money from American actors, and then further up from US foundations, and then those US foundations are connected to US billionaires very closely related to the US Republican Party. Just one example, the DeVos Foundation, it belongs to the DeVos family, which Betsy DeVos was the education secretary under the Trump administration. So from there all the way over to the US, we can trace the funding. Here's an overview of their offices in Europe. So you can see they're in London, Brussels, Strasbourg, Geneva, Vienna, and Rome. Most of those cities are where there are the headquarters of European human rights bodies, such as EU, Council of Europe, Fundamental Rights Agency, the courts, etc. And of course, Rome, obvious reasons. Next, we take a look at the Russian Federation. So in terms of there is data on the Russian Federation. What is meant to be transparent in the Russian Federation is transparent, but then there's a lot of dark money, which is by definition dark. You can't trace it except through certain media outlets. Three main sources of funding from the Russian Federation: oligarchs, then laundromats. Those are sort of all-purpose mechanisms where you channel dark money from the Russian Federation, the former Soviet states, put them through different mechanisms, and then they end up in Western Europe or other places. And then also increasingly state agencies created by the Russian government. So there we can account for at least $188 million coming from specifically 2 Russian oligarchs. So the 2 oligarchs are Vladimir Yakunin, who ran the Russian state railways for a certain amount of time, and then Konstantin Malofeyev. He's a far-right Eurasianist oligarch. Both of them have created quite a number of separate entities, so foundations, think tanks, sometimes political movements, different networks or dialogue fora. One of them organizes his own version of the Bergen exchanges called the Rhodes Forum, which brings together academics, business people, politicians, and all of this to exchange different ideas about many different things, but including the family and the role of religion in society, etc. So it's a way of socializing people towards these ideas. Both of these gentlemen have been banned in Western countries, and both of them have a number of connections with anti-gender organizations. And now we know that they're actually funding a number of anti-gender international congresses. There's one specifically called the World Congress of Families, which brings together all the different actors from all over the world. The last one took place in Verona in Italy. It was opened by one of the guest speakers was Matteo Salvini of La Liga. And then also you have a number of these people, these 2 Russian men, or at least Vladimir Yakunin, he doesn't come, but he sends his wife, Mathea. She's the one that gives the speeches. And then far-right political parties are there as well. And then they're connected to the Russian Orthodox Church. Mathea, I give you permission to let me know when I'm running out of time, yes. Okay? That's fine. So this is how Russian money comes into Europe. So you have Moscow is there as the epicenter, and then you have funding flows to different entities or meetings or things like this across the European continent. However, both of them have been banned, and especially Constantin Mathea have been really banned in Europe. What we've noticed recently is that because they can't travel to Western countries anymore, they've shifted focus. And so Constantin Mathea, now he's in charge of an investment entity for the Russian Federation focusing on Africa. So we can see there that influence will then shift over to Africa. Now Europe, this is interesting. So you can see Europe, that's the biggest increase in funding over this 10-year period. And the sources of the funding we can find come from essentially 20 mainly private foundations, and then being spent on a whole range of different NGOs and entities. And for the sake of simplicity, I've tried to regroup them into 5 main categories of civil society actors: anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, social media mobilization. There's a pseudo-Catholic network, which is a genuine version of the type of cult that Gökhan is a member of. And then there's a Christian political party. Naturally, the organizations don't do just 100% anti-abortion and no anti-LGBT. It bleeds into each other. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just trying to regroup them in this way. And they all belong to informal networks, where they focus their efforts on these things. So in terms of the private foundations, we can see a number of them here. So there's European Family Foundation. There's a very large one from France called the Fondation Jérôme Lejeune, which is one of the largest private foundations in France, which does a lot of actual very good academic scientific research on Down syndrome and genetic diseases. It's founded after the scientist who discovered the gene for trisomy 21 for Down syndrome. He happened to be a member of Opus Dei. Once you discover the gene for a genetic disease such as this, you can test for it. Now that there's testing for Down syndrome, it's over 90% of fetuses with Down syndrome that are aborted. So imagine for a scientist who is a practicing Catholic to have made such a discovery, it was a personal tragedy. So now he devoted a lot of his effort of his foundation to promoting pro-life issues, so anti-abortion issues. So a lot of the initiatives which go against abortion, pitting abortion against disability rights, comes from that foundation. And then you have a number of other foundations linked to European politicians from Italy and Spain, and then also a number of foundations from Germany. There, it's interesting, the German ones tend to be linked to the aristocracy of Germany, since it transitioned to a republic back in the 20th century, but the aristocracy was allowed to keep its land and much of its wealth, and then they've continued to support conservative causes. So most of these foundations are not at all transparent. Okay, so there's no legal requirement for them to be transparent. So it's difficult to get information. Here's a look at the different European anti-gender NGO funders. So they're regrouped into those 5 categories. You can see, One of Us, Against Abortion, they started in 2013. They've been able to generate 31 million. The strange ultra-Catholic cult-like movement, originally from Brazil way back in the 60s, is the biggest anti-gender civil society movement present in about 12 different countries in Europe, able to generate at least $113 million over this 10-year period. And it's within that movement that you have the organization Ordo Juris, which is behind, in Poland, which is behind the bill to ban abortion, LGBT free zones that you may have heard about, a bill to criminalize sexuality education called Stop Pedophilia. So this is the type of norms that they're launching. Then if we take a look beneath the iceberg, so the 700 million, that's really the top of it, that's the visible part. But then I was interested, where do they get their money? Okay, because that's the interesting bit. And 4 main sources of fundraising that I could identify, which is very similar to what normal or progressive civil society does. They just do it in their own way. So grassroots fundraising / astroturfing, economic and social elites, state support, and religious networks. So we'll take a closer look at each one of those. But in terms of astroturfing, we have there at least two models. One is tradition, family, and property. This network, which again started out in Brazil, it's more or less dead there, but here it's very active. What they do is, well, both of these models, they use petitions to they generate social indignation, generate petitions. People sign up to do something about the petition, so tell the UN to stop promoting abortion or preserve this Catholic right within the church, or etc. So you support this. Then they have the names, the email addresses. With that, then they spam their different supporters for contributions. And then also what we've seen, especially in Germany and in Spain, is that they have gone from social mobilizer to political actor, where now they're supporting far-right or alt-right political parties, so that it is personalities within these organizations in Spain and in Germany, which then form important constituent parts of the Alternative für Deutschland alt-right political party and the Vox political party in Spain. Social and economic elites. So you have the normal 1%. This was well known from the United States. Jane Mayer had written a book called Dark Money, which showed how the 1%, the billionaires of the United States, were funding the US Republican, Tea Party, Christian right movement. But there had not been much information about this in Europe, whereas we have as many wealthy people and corporations as the United States does. What we can see is that they are part of the funding landscape for this movement in Europe. And then a specific subset, which I suspect is quite unique to Europe, are what Andreas Kemper from Germany has called clerical aristocratic networks. So these are these aristocratic families very present in mainly Catholic countries, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain. These names all come up quite regularly, so that I mean, when you're researching something, it's not normal that you come across the name Falch-Eriksen across many different entities, whereas you do when you are researching these entities. So this is just a quick overview of the European brands which are associated with funding anti-gender organizations. So just maybe 2 weeks ago, it hit the Spanish media that the big department store, El Corte Inglés, which if you've been to Spain, you've probably been in one of these department stores, has been funding Citizen Go, which in turn has been funding the Vox political party. The French giant in terms of insurance, AXA, even I have insurance from the AXA group, has been funding La Manif pour tous, which Ruth showed images of the demonstrations back in 2013 and 14. And then if you like Catalan Cava, then Frexenet is a brand also that's been involved in this. So,
this is the end of it.
Yeah. Another source of support has been from state sources. So we see that governments, national governments or local authorities, regional governments are funding anti-gender organizations in a range of different areas. One of the most common sources of ways of funding has been to provide money to anti-gender organizations, which then engage in crisis pregnancy counseling. So this is when an entity sets up a fake service to deceive women about their pregnancy solutions. And these are getting funding from a lot of different regional governments in Spain, even EU funding in Slovakia and in different countries. Another direction of funding has been for school curricula. So coming up with different types of curricula which avoid the need to discuss sexuality for young people and instead promote human dignity. So basically it's a secularized way of teaching Catholic principles based on human dignity. Then there's also funding political activism, so that one of the 5 groups, being one of the 5 civil society actors, is the European Christian Political Movement, which is a political party. 80% of its funding comes from the European Parliament, and then this one has been one of the main actors involved in contestation around the Istanbul Convention around Eastern Europe. And then in a certain number of countries, especially the ones who have really slipped down the illiberal slide, the governments are funding their own friendly civil society groups. So they defund the human rights, the traditional progressive society, and then instead provide alternative funding to the conservative, ultra-conservative civil society groups, which then act as a government echo chamber for the government, so that the Polish government can rely on civil society, which it is funding, telling it that no, Poland is doing well in terms of rule of law and democracy. That's fine. So, and you have this also in Hungary and other places. And then we're seeing also the emergence of soft diplomacy. So states becoming actors in their own right in promoting anti-gender initiatives. Okay. And we see this from the Russian Federation. I myself attended a meeting of the Eurasian Women's Forum, with Russia becoming a leader on the women's issue. So I can say more about this during the coffee break, but already, so you have examples of this taking place. And then finally, another type of funding source, it comes from religious networks. So mainly around Catholic networks, but also increasingly Protestant networks, and from Eastern countries, Russia or Orthodox networks are also present. The Orthodox network is very often also linked with local oligarchs. And then maybe I'll just end here. I think this is the last slide or the next one. Just some 5 components of the anti-human rights infrastructure of the EU. So we have, over the past 10 years, what we've seen is the emergence of new transnational coalitions, which are thematic or activity specific. We have the anti-gender organizations, which have transitioned from having mainly a normative objective. Now, a certain subset of them have a clear political objective. We have a new anti-gender social media platform, which is being influential on the continent. We have a professionalized presence in the EU. Again, this is and in the EU and the human rights institutions. So this is a relatively new phenomenon of the past 10 years. And what we see is that they have infiltrated the actual power structures at EU level or Council of Europe level and in a number of different member states. So I think, yes, and I'll just end here. This is a picture of one of their anti-gender meetings, and then we're able to reconstitute who it is that's funding them. So Agenda Europe, US groups, Citizen Go based in Spain, the European Parliament with European Christian Political Movement, this strange Brazilian cult, TFP, and then the Vatican itself. So that's how it is that they all come together to actually organize their own version of the Bergen exchanges. Okay. So,
Right. Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Neil. So whilst we are sorting out the next PowerPoint, I just want to ask you, Neil. I just have a few short questions. First of all, I'm wondering how long you've been, because this report that you've written encompasses so much, and I'm wondering how long have you been studying this? How long have you been working on these networks? And then also, how are you studying these networks? Like you said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. They are clandestine and they're secretive. How do you go about when you want to study these groups?
Yeah, well, I've been following these groups. Thank you for the question. I've been following these groups for about 10 years now. So, so you get to know them. You know who the principal actors are within them. Each one also has their own personality, so you can see how it is that they evolve. And then for the actual research for the financial numbers, that took about 3 years. The lockdown over the past 18 months helped a lot. And then just sort of researching, and then also reaching out to different colleagues in different around different countries in Europe to help find out about what the information is. And then in Europe, it's not just difficult to get the information, but once you get it, it's in national languages, and it conforms to national accounting standards. So you have to get help in deciphering what does this financial data mean. So that took some time to do as well. And then, but at least it's rather rewarding, because with these 3 reports, it's been able to set a new narrative for how these organizations are, or how this movement is understood. They've tried to present themselves as nice, gentle little Christians. whereas simply advocating for life and family and religious freedom, whereas now they're understood to be what they are, which is religious extremists. And they themselves recognize that they've had to leave a number of international institutions so that today they're much less present than they were in 2017 and 18. On the other hand, what they've done is they've retrenched themselves at national level in a certain number of countries. And there, Poland, Hungary, to a certain extent Spain, and there it's much harder to get at them. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So next up we have Asgeir, and then the PowerPoint should be up. No, not yet. Okay. Just another question for Neil in the meantime, then, if that's okay. You said that you get to know these organizations when you follow them, and you find that they have their own personalities. They also get to know you. They know about you, and you've been targeted. Could you say a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. Thank you. I meant to say this in the opening, but I forgot. But it would have been a good transition with the previous panel, where as a result of two of these reports have had some traction. And so I've been invited to speak at the European Parliament on two occasions this year. One was on the situation of abortion in Poland, and another one was on the financing of these groups, an inquiry of the European Parliament into this. And as a result of both of these presentations and the associated reports about them, then I've been served with legal papers by, on the one hand, Ordo Juris from Poland. That's this Brazilian sect type of thing. And then separately, this was just last month on July 7th by Citizen Go in Spain for this report that I just presented here, where they're making allegations about using illegal material, and what they've done is so it's a certain strategy which on the one hand is meant to intimidate someone, and I think myself and I think the others, when they receive these letters just or these threats based on the previous panel, I think it's an effective intimidation tool. But then also, at least with these guys, it's accompanied with other strategies where both of them sent out email blasts or petitions fundraising in order to sue Neil Datta. So why would a Polish person or Spanish person contribute 10, 15 euros to sue Neil Datta? I don't know, but they are doing this. And then the actual lawsuit is the combination of, they've been engaging in an advocacy campaign. They've been, saying things about me. I'm a Soros agent. I'm far left, but obviously I am. Exactly, yeah. And so it's part of all of this. And then the actual lawsuit is the logical culmination of their own advocacy and fundraising campaign. But in the end, I don't think, we'll see how far they take it, but I don't think that they actually need to take it very far. They just need to do a pro forma showing of going through a lawsuit, then they'll lose, and then that's it. And then they'll move on to the next thing. The Ordo Juris lawsuit against me was dismissed by the Warsaw courts in June. Now they're appealing, but it looks like they'll lose that as well, hopefully. But yeah, so that's also happening.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Asgeir, now the PowerPoint is ready for you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'm very happy for your background. Yes, thank you. I was introduced. I was on the right. Let's get into it. You are sitting on Facebook, and into your feed pops a topic that you have become a bit engaged in. You even liked it. You pushed like, and you shared it. You allow yourself 5 minutes time with this topic. You live outside Norway, but for some reason your topic has made you build a grudge against Norwegian Child Protection Service. You read an article about how migrant children are removed from homes in Norway. In your feed, allegedly, this is done because of racist policies, demanding that Norwegian child protection services is mandated to separate migrant children from their parents, or to force families to become Norwegian. 10 minutes in, you see another article problematizing the same level of racism. And you click on that one too. You like it, you push like. And then another comes along, and another. Eventually, your 5 minutes became half an hour or an hour. You are firmly down the rabbit hole at this point. And you are continuously fed the opinion you search for. You like the confirmation you get as it reaffirms what you believe. Apparently, Norwegian Child Protection Services is really, really racist. Okay, so what just happened? Suddenly have a distrust in a government you're not a part of, and you didn't used to have it. Now, similar kind of topics and motives, as Neil has talked about, can also push narratives of nationalistic sentiments, anti-immigration, LGBTQ hatred, religious extremism, and so on. What pushed you down that rabbit hole is a powerful tool to promote distrust and to also subvert current social order. To explain this, I will draw on an insight made by John Locke in a groundbreaking contribution to political philosophy, Two Treatises of Government. And yes, the irony is here. I'm going to use John Locke to explain something about Facebook, so I know that. so John Locke argued that by their reason alone, the community put the legislative power into such hands as they think fit, with this trust that they shall be governed by declared laws. By this trust, according to this very influential insight, everyone within a community always were to accept and find legitimate those who governed, if those who governed attended the entrustment they were given by the community. This is a precondition for popular sovereignty, which again is a precondition for democracy, namely that the people institute a government they think is fit for them. Now, the level of trust, if we ask a sample of each country's or community population, we can see that government is perceived as not acting on the trust provided by the community in question. If you ask them, although European countries are governing according to declared laws, it might not be perceived as such. Although we can all scream declared laws from the rooftops, it doesn't matter for trust, because the perception, how it is felt and how perception are acted upon and guides you, can contest the very character of social order and how it is interconnected to democratic rule of law. Trust can be based on false premises. Locke goes on and says, no edict of anybody else have the force and obligation of a law which has not its sanction from that legislature which the public has chosen and appointed. Law, according to Locke, has to have the consent of society, a consent that draws upon the bond of society, that is the trust that keeps society together, what he referred to as vinculum societatis. Locke argued that nothing could override the legislature that honored that trust. Hence, when the legislator crafts legislation, it must also abide by the popular will of the people to fulfill the second dimension of popular sovereignty. Declared laws are always in flux and always the object of critique, as it must respond to democracy through time. Constitutional democratic rule of law, then, can thereby be the very target for subverting trust, because it speaks to the bond of society. So what then is the mechanism that tries to subvert trust? What you aim for? In order to answer this, we need to go further beyond Locke and to understand the components of trust briefly. And trust is a mechanism consisting of a multitude of components. So a standard definition is A person that trusts A takes a risk by entrusting an object of trust C to person B. A trusts B with the object C. By doing so, A has a lack of knowledge regarding how B performs with the entrusted object C. Hence, there is a risk and a component of not knowing what happens with what you trust people to do. A nevertheless expects B to handle the object of trust, C, according to the anticipations of A. While A commits a risk and trusts B to do something with C, A correspondingly loses control of C. This lack of control is basic to popular sovereignty as well. Those who rule are entrusted a whole range of Cs. A simply do not know for sure what happens to C. When A trusts government to act on declared laws and that they abide by this trust, A expects government to do just that, but also that what the government does is something in the range of what you can expect, and you don't know that. Don't know. Depending on how the trust action is experienced, A will adjust expectations accordingly. So if B treats C according to the expectations of A, the bond of trust will be reinforced. While if B do not meet with A's expectations, and it is to the detriment of A will not necessarily trust B at the next intersection. Knowing that one of the building blocks of trust is A's use of expectations, this can become utilized as a source for subverting trust, create polarization, and bend popular support towards your will. So to make Norwegian child protection services stand out as undermining so-called traditional family values, you can make persons question their expectations towards such services and gradually and simultaneously provide the answer in what is a good and decent child protection service to what that maintain traditional family values. Claiming that Norwegian child protection services is racist is thereby only a first step, while the second is to promote the natural solution, which is to replace the existing norms of order in order. As touched upon through Locke, modern constitutional democracies have the potential of crafting legislation that draws on expectations that are characteristical to any trust relation and stabilize them into law. By stabilizing behavioral expectations through embedding them as rules in legal codes, the expectations become declared laws, ones that Locke talked about, that are reference points on what to expect of others, that these laws govern and maintain order within the community. By questioning what to expect from child protection services or other service types, by challenging what A, as a truster, does not know anything about, namely what happens to the entrusted object, trust can become subverted. In this way, challenging expectations people have becomes a challenge to how citizens interact in themselves, between themselves. If the goal of those involved is to subvert those expectations that are stabilized into law, a place to start is to question those expectations that are embedded in the social fabric itself, to identify them and target them. What binds us together? It can be your sense of patriotism that they appeal to, or that you should be proud of your common heritage, your nation, that those you share historic ties with are your brothers and so on, that families have become too soft, that strength is a male feature justifying patriarchies, that LGBTQ is a threat towards God and so on. How you interact with your peers can be targeted by other groups that Neil are talking about here, and they do so by questioning expectations. They do not do this explicitly, but this is done indirectly. Correspondingly, a subversion of what binds society together is a step back into disorder and distrust. If members of the community wants to interact and be governed by declared laws drawn from the trust that binds society together. Knowing what to expect of others is at the core of how order can be secured, re-established, and also cultivated. Hence, developing workable expectations that individuals know about and they can act on would incrementally establish and expand order. And any threat towards this process have the opposite effect, namely to disintegrate order and cause distrust. If certain actors want to change the direction of how expectations are met, they use the toolkits of constitutional democracy to reach their end. But to reach this end, they will breach the very constitutionality such a system depends on. Expectations that are acted on needs to pass the test of mutual understanding in order to prevail. If not, and it is demanded that you act according to certain expectations you do not freely would choose, it has become a breach of your personal liberty, of your freedom from interference, which is a foundational component to constitutional democracies. The infrastructure of, for instance, Facebook that we started with is set to keep you on Facebook, keep you there and make you click, like, and share as much as you can, as long as you can. This is a potent tool for disinformation, fake news, and propaganda. It is not the only one, but it is the biggest one. So Facebook has begun to take this more seriously, but have a long way to go. And also, for the record, Norwegian Child Protection Services is not racist. Thank you.
Okay. Then the final presentation is Mathea.
Yes, thank you. And this was such a great introduction to what I want to talk about, because I want to talk about the online spaces for discussion and information sharing. And then, of course, in relation to challenges of fake news, hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and how we can address these challenges. How, what are being done when it comes to preventing the spread of harmful content online. So first off, online platforms, I mean, as we know, and as Asgeir's talk has highlighted, has gained enormous traction in political and social discourse, with platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and even TikTok, evolving into huge transnational companies with great clouds in discourse, and also with a far global reach. And social media platforms have in particular been blamed for poor efforts when it comes to moderating content in many instances across the world. So of course we all know, like, they have been blamed for failing to protect users from foreign influence during elections, like in the US and France, and also in many African countries as well, or to failing to adequately moderate hate speech and fake news, disinformation, and political propaganda campaigns that have caused protests and ethnic violence, as you know from Ethiopia or Myanmar with the Rohingyas. Just to mention two examples. So, in the response to the 2016 elections in the US, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg said that, yes, we do take misinformation very seriously, but Facebook is not going to be the arbiter of truth. And this is a claim that Facebook and Instagram are still upholding. Just last night, I saw the head of Instagram saying that in the case of Afghanistan and Taliban, they're doing what they can, but they cannot be the arbiter of truth. That's their stance. But increasingly still, I mean, the question of how to sort of counteract the damage done by fake news has become a very pressing issue, both for technology companies and also for governments across the globe. So indeed, there is this growing debate about how to adequately regulate online content. And in this discussion, the human rights community and human rights defenders are making valuable contributions together with tech companies and governments. But still, I mean, and even though this is changing, me and a few colleagues are saying that this discussion is still predominantly taking place in Europe and North America. And actually, I wanted to show a picture. I forgot to ask about that.
Yeah,
that didn't happen. If you're interested, Google Facebook Transparency Center, and there you can find very interactive maps showing Facebook transparency reports. yeah, we're not seeing it here, but I just want to show this world map to sort of highlight that there are very big global differences, both in the legal requests that Facebook and also Twitter are receiving from governments for doing content removals, and also to what extent they are responding to these restrictions and actually removing content. And of course, we can talk more about this, but the laws they abide by, if they are sort of following their own policies for what content should be admitted to their or allowed on their platforms, or like local laws. But what I wanted to highlight with like showing this interactive map that you know Google on your phones is that there are very big global differences in the removal of harmful content by social media platforms. And this motivated me and two colleagues. So I didn't write this piece alone. I had very good help from Pauline Lemaire, which is a PhD candidate here at CMI, and Lisa Garg, who's at the PhD, she's finished her PhD on internet governance structures in Africa, now at the Hertie School in Berlin. We wanted to write a paper titled, "How are African countries responding to fake news and hate speech?" And we were indeed invited to contribute to a special issue called or titled "Tech Companies and Public Interest in Communication Information Society," which we're hoping will be published sometime soon. So if you're interested in social media platforms and regulation of online content, that's a recommendation. And just a note before I talk more about our paper, there are efforts at content moderation in the global south as well by social media platforms. So for instance, Facebook has established content moderation centers, the first one in Nairobi in 2019. But still, these approaches are far from optimal. I mean, Africa is a huge continent, more than 3,000 languages. So of course, the efforts that are being done are not adequate to moderate hate speech, fake news, misinformation, and disinformation online. So in the absence of social media platforms moderating or regulating online speech and information sharing, we asked, how do African countries respond to fake news and hate speech? And what we did in our paper is that it's very first attempt at starting to understand what are the dynamics and patterns at play. So what we did is that we used media discourse on in and off African countries on fake news, hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and we did an explorative structural topic model to sort of identify regulatory frames in media discourses. So basically, what regulation and what regulatory responses are being discussed. And we wanted to focus on the government actions. So our rationale is that in the absence of moderation by social media platforms, there seemed to be a stronger state-centric approach to regulating content online. And we sort of expected to see two main regulatory approaches, namely technical and legal, which can also be termed like architectural and institutional responses. So on the technical side, states can control the technical architecture of internet through executive decisions, thus influencing or restricting both the production of and access to information online or specific content. When it comes to legal approaches to content regulation, that's the predominant institutional strategy, and that can actually shape both the access and the production. So shape in beforehand what type of action or what type of content is being made and put online. And this can of course be then legislation in forms of different bills and laws and acts, but it can also be a judicial review of existing legislation by the courts. And we expected that those approaches would be largely informed by a regime's self-interest, and in particular their motivation to repress media freedom and also institutional constraints on the executive. And I hope I'm not taking too much time, but we did identify both of these two topics in the media coverage. So we do see a reflection of these two state-centric regulatory strategies. So for the technical, we do see that governments are technically blocking, manipulating, censoring specific online content. And we can see that in our topics that appeared in the modeling through words such as shutdown, cutting, blocking, blackouts, restrict, disrupt, etc. in countries such as Ethiopia, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Burundi. We also found the legal strategies topic, which we found very interesting. With the, of course, law, bill, draft, crime, punish, regulate. In countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and on issues of bloggers, but also cybercrime. And then, of course, we're interested in the motivation, like what are driving these different frames. So when analyzing which regime characteristics are driving the different frames, we did find that in particular for discussions when it comes to technical strategies, these are more salient in regimes with little respect for media freedom and less executive constraints. So that was sort of the most conclusive finding we had. And maybe, yeah, so as I said, this is like a stepping stone for like trying to explore the patterns. So that was sort of the most convincing we found. As for the legal topic, we see that it is more varied, and we see that this is an avenue that I'm sure this audience will agree on, that is going to need more research in the future as well. But overall, I mean, I think our findings suggest that the state is the dominant actor in shaping content regulation across African countries, and that's an important lesson to learn. And then we need to sort of pay attention to what sort of different legal strategies that different regimes are pursuing. So I just want to end up with a final point, which I think that our study is highlighting, and that is in order to safeguard online spaces for discussion and information sharing, there is a balance between respecting and restricting individuals' rights and freedom of expression. And in going forward, we have to have a look at both what platforms are doing or not, and what governments are doing, keeping in mind that some political regimes can use the absence of moderation by tech companies and social media platforms to legitimize harsher clampdown on freedom of expression. And we have many examples of that we can discuss more. But also the irony here is that in the greater sort of activism around information rights, we see that in Europe, there is more sort of a call for governments to take a step up and sort of challenge and tackle these unruly social media platforms. While in Africa and the global south, there is actually more call for, social media presence to take a more active role than in regulating spaces for freedom of expression. And I think that's important to bring on in the discussion. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So much for three really, really interesting presentations. We will shortly turn to some questions from the audience, but would you like to start with some comments to each other's presentations?
So many comments and thoughts, but we should start with questions.
Are there any questions from the audience now? Or from the chat? No? Okay, well, I'll start with a question from me then, and first to you, Neil. We've been discussing this earlier in past events today as well, but I would like to pick up the thread because I think this is so interesting. So some of these anti-gender transnational movements that you have been talking about are intervening in cases that are brought up to the European Convention, the European Court of Human Rights, including cases that are regarding children and care order cases. And the last couple of years, there are many examples of Norway being taken to the court for violating the right to family. And so I'm wondering, how are these organizations intervening or engaging in these processes? And maybe Asgeir also can fill in on this. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is in terms of how do they fit in with the contestation around child rights and child protective services, is something I've only started to take a look at. But already within those organizations I presented, if you just think back to the 5 different main categories or networks, so I've already started taking a look at each one of them and how do they address the issue of children. Okay, now all of them address the issue of children in some way, usually from the perspective of the unborn child. Okay, so that's okay. So there's that, but that's not what's interesting for us. But all of them do address it in some way. Separately, how many of those groups actually have the capacity to engage with the European Court of Human Rights or other type of litigation or quasi-adjudicatory systems? The number is very small. From 54 organizations, you can boil it down to like 5, barely that. Okay. And of those organizations that are there, 2 of them are American. Okay, so already one of the contributions of the U.S. Antigender or Christian right, is to bring the decades of litigation in US courts on social issues over to Europe. So you have Alliance Defending Freedom, European Centre for Law and Justice are the main ones. And then you have local groups. You have, although UiB is more than local group, but you have lawyers organizations, Christian lawyers organizations in different countries. And just for example, today, we learned that although UiB was meeting with Abogados Cristianos, Christian lawyers from Spain in Warsaw, and they were signing an MOU to collaborate together. So already there's that subset. And then if you take a look at how many of them are engaging in the child protection services, I haven't completed the research, but already we can see although UiB is one of them. So although UiB has, has produced a whole pamphlet on Barnevernet and how bad it is. And I think for that, you have to go through maybe two of Asgeir's rabbit holes. One is a rabbit hole about parental rights versus the state. Okay, so there, that's something very well articulated. You see Alliance Defending Freedom present there as well. Then you have to go to another rabbit hole, that which is anti-Norway propaganda or anti-Nordic social welfare system propaganda. And there you find other materials developed by Ordo Juris and other organizations, but mainly Ordo Juris, which explain what a hellhole Norway is to live in and how people are unhappy and the state is intervening in everything. And so you have that as aspect of it as well. So I think it fits a bit with what Asgeir and Marie-Louise were explaining, where you have different aspects of fake news, which then reinforce each other towards a certain desired outcome.
Yeah, to fill in, it is the kind of the threat that they feel against the tradition of what they call the traditional family value. As I see that children, for instance, have the right to family life. This is in order to enforce that, you need to engage in families and sometimes take court orders and remove them. And this idea that children that more like 50 years ago, they were kind of the sole responsibility of parents. This is some of the ideas that they want to go back to, this idea about patriarchy. And I do think that it's a way for them to try to subvert the idea of right to family life that children doesn't have it, but the parents do. So they kind of want us to believe that if we're going to have a rights-based system, we can interpret that in many different ways, but you simultaneously obviously remove the dignity of the child as a rights holder. You have to do that in order to reach their end. So what they are doing is that they are using the constitutional democracy, the toolkit, so to speak, the freedom that they have to just have opinions and challenge them and just go for them, but they do not simultaneously understand that this presupposes that rights are universal, they are equally distributed to maintain a principle of equality that is quite basic to the rule of law. So children have a right to family life, but they don't like that. So yeah.
Yeah, just I mean, it's really resonates with the whole like illiberal pushback. I mean, it's much more focused on sort of individualistic rights more than the collective sort of family values conservative. So yeah, I think you're really right. It's also like it's going towards all these like both like women's rights, children's rights. It's also pushing against like this individualistic concept of the society, sort of grounding the common family.
Yes. Okay. We have questions from the audience. Please, Lisa. You need to come up here.
So, thank you very much. So, I have a question about Neil to the two of you, in a sense. So, Neil, you just told us that these fearmongers, if I can use that word, are now moving grounds to Africa. And so I want to know, with the work that you've been doing and the kind of data and the methodology that you've been using, do you think it would be possible to sort of catch these these organizations, once they come in, would you be able to use your analysis to catch this sort of moving phenomenon? Because what I learned from you was that one of the problems is that we don't have enough data and we don't have enough knowledge. And so it may actually be really difficult to follow Neil's story. So I just wanted to know what do you think the chances are? And, from what you've done, if there are where you can take that. And then I was thinking also back to, to what should a government like the Norwegian do? Now we know, there is data showing that this is true slander. These are two rabbits hole and, coming up here. Is this something a government can fight, and should it fight it? Those are my two questions.
You have to, I think. It's not done. In Norway, we have a problem with child protection services because Neil used the word bleed into. It bleeds into Norway as well. This suspiciousness that is it destroys public discourse. And so what you can do from a bureaucratic point of view, when you are in government and you are there to implement policies and all these you're part of the problem. So you're in their view. But what you can do is to enforce your role as providing for the democratic discourse to be both transparent and that you follow certain rules of discourse, which means that when you have opinions that really are absurd, that can be proven, and you can go for it. If we are not the arbiter of truth, well, you have Australia that says, well, you need to do something because this is not allowed for. And then Mark Zuckerberg tried to, then I'm leaving, and then ciao. So it's the one that is supposed to maintain the rights of children. That's the state. That's the one key role they have. The constitutionality of enforce. They need to enforce the rights. Yeah. But on the other hand, you have the bureaucracy. They also need to develop services. And you need to, in between how this is working with democratic discourse, need to be enlightened and you need to be informed. So it is a role for the state to actually intervene and say something. But the flip side is what is going on in Africa, where freedom of speech and the liberty is actually enforced by what I understood was private part, and that's also absurd because rights need to be guaranteed from a political point of view. So yeah, that was the last question.
The other one is for you.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Yes. So speaking of Australia, it's really cool that they actually did take the Facebook to court over the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for instance. That's power. So thank you, Lisa. Is this possible to do in Africa? I think as we talked about yesterday as well, authorization dynamics, we talked about the global shift power shifts globally and sort of more anti-liberal, right? Or more anti-liberal diffusion as well, seeping in, getting more it's more legitimate to sort of have a more liberal norm diffusion, to sort of see that now in Africa as well. I guess in some sense, you can say that if we see this in democracy promotion, why should we not see this in civil society as well? I think what is difficult, of course, is the fact that they are more secretive and elusive, as Mathea also said. So it will be maybe not so visible, but I do think that I don't know, in civil society in Africa, it's always been a huge focus on, especially funding resources or funding sources. And that is sort of a liability for the civil society actors working in democracy promotion. So why should not the same thing go for the rest? I'm not sure. That's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Whether it's actually possible to sort of capture it by the sort of analysis that we did, again, really depends on the how open and free the space is for spreading that type of information. As I said, what we did was sort of media analysis, or seeing how how are the regulatory strategies being framed, and of course that is very dependent on the media space itself. That would be interesting to know. I'm not sure if I can come with something more concrete than that, but yeah, let's look into that. Yeah. Well, and also I was thinking, sorry, just one thing that struck me as well, like when we're looking at funding and sort of lifting the veil of like, what makes the money behind it? I was actually thinking of UiB and party financing, like especially in Africa, that's been a huge, or actually all over, right? I mean, who are actually funding political parties? And then why don't we know this for very strong civil society organizations, especially when that is one of the arguments that the anti-liberal movements are making towards the sort of liberal movements, right? I mean, they want to see the funding and want to see where the money comes from. So I think this is, I mean, it's really effective and valuable. And also what we see from civil society research is that actually the strategy of sort of lifting the veil or naming and shaming can be quite effective. Yeah. So it's very interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Questions? More questions? Marit? Yeah.
Thank you. Great talks from Asgeir and Lisa Maria and Neil, and thank you for good moderating, Mathea. So I think I have just tapping into some of the questions that you already have addressed. But so first to you, Asgeir. So when you talk about public discourse, democratic discussions, open debates, do you see any potential to having a platform in which you will have a rational, open, sensible discourse? So that is the first one. And I'm not actually thinking of the US, I'm just kind of thinking within Europe and even just tapping into Norway and the Nordic countries, if that can kind of, if you can have any examples, illustrations of that. Secondly, I was wondering, and that's going into your talk, Neil, because when you're describing these ultra-conservative religious organizations, it seems to me that in one way they are operating like ordinary civil society organizations. But on the other hand, we also have this wheel of that secrecy over them, or that we find them that they're doing something which is not legal, or there's something is just hidden. So would you say a little bit more about, are they just using legitimate strategies? Are they quite similar to those that we consider to be legit civil society organization? Or do they also have something else that they are doing that we should be scared of and suspicious of? So I think that was my two kind of main questions, and I think that Lisa Maria, you are kind of covering in, especially in the public debate discourse, because you have pointed to the fake news part of it, which is just really scary. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
It was a question. Yes, I can go first. I have the solution is not the answer to your question because I really don't, but it needs to be a combination, because social media is a powerful tool for good also. So it's just that we need to realize, I think, that this is in an historic time very, very new, and we don't know how to actually treat it. And I think that at least in what happened in 2016, the election in the US was especially important with regard to waking up to understand how you can use social media to just corrupt the minds of a lot of people simultaneously. And I do believe that holding these platforms accountable, I don't know how, but if there's an audit or anything, they should maintain this themselves. But as you said, they're not the arbiter of truth, but they have to be, because they are allowing. They're just an infrastructure, but they are an infrastructure of algorithms that sends you rubbish. If you like rubbish, then you send it, and that should not be. It doesn't stand the test of an argument. It doesn't. It's not rooted in reality, but it has very real consequences, and so they need to be held accountable for that and change. And also this needs to be part of the discussion. Where are they going to change into? I'm talking about social media platforms. So it's, and also the public, the states have this obligation simultaneously to put out information all the time that is both transparent, testable, and that is not propaganda, because it can't be that. So it needs to, there's a fine line in balancing that from the public as well, but it's when it comes to social media platforms, they need to be held accountable. I think that's a step.
Can I just chip in? I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree. But I mean, your question is really good. Is it possible to have spaces that are free of? I mean, it's a huge challenge. And I think Facebook. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and defend them, but I mean, they have done a lot of improvements in a few years. Yeah. So I mean, but obviously it's super difficult, right? And I mean, they just opened up this Facebook News. Now they're going to be a news platform as well. So I mean, I think they're just making life really difficult for themselves. But I think it's really, and we're also going to talk more about like technology. We talked about it this morning. We're going to talk about it more like this combination of like, yes, you can do so much with artificial intelligence, but in the end, you actually need humans who are sitting being content moderators in different centers all around the world, all in different continents and different dialects. And so it's a massive, massive undertaking as well. Yeah. Sorry.
And there was a question for
Yes,
you.
Mathea had asked something.
Yeah.
And you were asking if what these anti-gender groups is legitimate or hidden or dark or something like that. First, from what I can see, the strategies and the tactics that they utilize are legitimate advocacy lobbying tactics. Okay, they create petitions, they go see decision makers, etc. What is relevant to understand here is that in Europe, this is a new phenomenon. So what they're able to do is they benefit from the naivete of decision makers. When someone says, hi, I'm from an NGO, I represent religious freedom, then the parliamentarian will think, oh, that's lovely, let's have a chat. So our political class is not equipped to deal with a new generation of civil society actors, which basically don't adhere to human rights or fundamental rights, or they don't have the same grounding in human rights that many other NGOs will have, where civil society actors, usually they represent their own little church, but they recognize the legitimacy of all the other ones as well. So we're dealing with a new phenomenon here. Second point is that they tend to camouflage who and what they're really about, so that a number of the American actors present in Europe are very well known in the United States. But they benefit from the fact that in Europe, we don't know who these US groups are until you do research about them, and then you reveal who they are. So that, for example, one of them, Alliance Defending Freedom, was asking for participatory status at the Council of Europe, which would allow it to interact with the institution. And it took a number of progressive groups to inform the staff of the Council of Europe, look, Alliance Defending Freedom, they're not just about religious freedom. They are, in fact, in the United States, listed as a hate group because they support gay conversion therapy. And here's all the documentation. And then they were quickly thrown out. Then finally, is what they're doing legal? Most of what they're doing is plenty legal, but there are some cases where what they do is a bit dodgy. So that, for example, with the Spanish group Citizen Go, there are allegations that it acts as a conduit for extra legal funding to support the far-right political party. So that you have the NGO on the one hand, the far-right political party on the other hand. You, as a donor, if you fund the political party, you have to declare this, there's limitations and all of this. If you fund the NGO, you can do what you want. The NGO in its own activities will indirectly support the political party by running attack ads against the opponents of that political party. So there's limits to legality. And then finally, a number of these groups, they present themselves as nice Christian groups, but then you take a look at who do they play with behind closed doors, and it's usually with far-right groups that would not be acceptable even within their own polite society.
Thank you. We also have a question from Siri.
Thank you all. It's just extremely fascinating and scary. But so I had a lot of thoughts when you were speaking, and I'm just going to make some comments. So I think one is that struck me is how extremely contextual. How sort of you alluded to that, Lisa Maria, and we talked about it in the last panel. How, for instance, private universities can sort of be helpful in some contexts and be really problematic in other contexts. And I'm just thinking that in many African contexts, it depends on what the government is like, but also what the alternatives are and who you don't want to regulate. And I think that is also an issue. So somebody needs to regulate, and who should, and particularly at the national context. And I think that's something that is super interesting and sort of comes out of the talk. The other one is, and it links to what you were just saying, and also to Lisa's question earlier. It would be super interesting to know what you're seeing about what these other groups are doing in the rest of the world. If you're seeing this sort of when you investigate it, because I think we know very little about what these groups are doing in the African continent and also beyond, but we do know that the churches are super strong, and it just sort of brings me to this sort of, so these groups, many of them are extremely well rooted in society. They're connected to society in a way that traditional NGOs in these countries are not at all. And to some extent also in the European context, particularly sort of in the churches and in the Catholic Church and so on, that many of these organizations are much more de-linked, and that they're able to connect, they're able to crowd fund in a way that traditional civil society isn't. And I'm just thinking that in some ways, that is in a way more of the challenge that we're facing, almost more than the hidden part of the network, which is also super interesting and which is related, as you've been showing, and I think that's great. But I also think we need to think about sort of how because that's a very fundamental challenge, that these are sort of groups that have bonds, that are both able to actually, even in very poor countries, create a lot of domestic funding. And also, and of course also in rich countries. So it's not only about external groups funding, it's also about sort of the way in which the right, and the right sort of populist right, if you want, is sort of rooting itself in a very interesting and scary way.
Do you comment on that, anyone?
I can just say that in terms of their grounding within society for these anti-gender groups, a few things to keep in mind. Very often they present themselves as citizens' initiatives, but I didn't do it in the presentation. But if you scratch beneath the surface, what you will find are elites behind the foundation of these groups. So that very often, and so it's more likely a case of astroturfing. And but at the same time, from that initial seed funding, they're able to generate public support. But then separately, they're also able to tap into religious networks, and which are well organized. And then within these religious networks, there is a cultural tradition of giving money. So they can tap into that. This is not always well appreciated. So that in Poland, with Ordo Iuris, it is the Catholic bishops themselves who have warned Polish citizens that the fundraising initiatives of the Ordo Iuris organizations are not linked to the church. And so if they want to give to the church, they should give here, but not there. So there's some, there's some misdirection there.
It's really interesting. It's also like tapping into what you said, I mean, about so these movements that managing to tapping into like a dynamic that we see on social media platforms. But it's not just like it was like crowdsource, like source funding as well. But maybe traditional civil society organizations are not managing to make use of in the same way. Maybe that's also a bit cause for concern if because we just like the traditional civil society sector in especially in Western country, like the participation is going down. So maybe that's a lesson to learn.
When the public discourse went online, I think it's really immature, because now you can go and get your money wherever, and you can where you used to have had to start contextually, and I think with many are there still, that you have this person living here and be organized like that. Just the fact that you can talk to and be engaged in arguments about Norwegian child protection services, and you live in a very other country than Norway, is a new challenge, and it really isn't answered, I think. So it's the fragmentation. It is a very active public discourse, but it's just not in the same character at all.
Contextualize.
Okay, are there more questions from the audience? Any?
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to thank you all for dedicating so much time and effort to this important topic and something that seems like an insurmountable challenge. So thank you. My question is what we can maybe do to help the public distinguish between the good and the bad between these actors that are out there. Because it seems to me that from what you said, Neil, also that often the illusion is created that it's a citizen initiative or sometimes that's a research institute and it seems like legitimate, and they drag people into their sort of sphere by really appealing to quite common sense things like, oh, we want to help the oppressed people that are suffering at the hands of the system. But how can we maybe, I don't know, label or communicate what is legitimate and what isn't legitimate, given that, for example, the Juris reports look like research reports. It's very much cherry picking, but it takes some quite skilled person to distinguish that. So do we need a European label on organizations that are transparent and conformant with human rights? Or what is there something we can do as researchers to actively distance ourselves from certain organizations and be more vocal about it? Is there anything we can do as people here in the room maybe to contribute to that?
Thank you, Jenny. Very good question. Who wants to start?
Do what he does.
Yeah.
I don't think there's an easy answer to that because I devote a lot of my time to these organizations, but at the same time I respect their right to exist, to say what they want to say. But what I have found that works is it's rather long haul work where you have to educate people about who these organizations are, what are they doing, what is their origin, and who's behind this, and what impact does it have in the countries where they have been successful. So that now, although UiS has become a common name inside the European Parliament, in part because of our report, but also because now people see that what's happening in Poland is having an impact on LGBT people, on women. And so I think it's this type of long haul pedagogical work that we have to do, at least with our political classes or decision makers. I mean, for example, one thing I want to get my head around is why on earth does the European Court of Human Rights allow amicus briefs from Alliance Defending Freedom and UiS? There's no need for this. One of them is a known hate group in the United States.
Yeah.
So very short. I also had education. It's sort of like the more general go-to. But I'm actually really curious to see how that's going to show in your work as well. Like we're educating youth nowadays to be like critical citizens, to always be critical thinkers about the sources they see and everything. I'm wondering then, how in 50 years will we have the same trust levels in our societies? Just because we need people to be more critical, and that means less trusting of. I'm curious.
Less trust. Questioning, being critical. I think civics can play a role in it. Make everybody read Amy Gutman, but it's that is a good start. But I do think Neil is really right about this, taking it a little bit slow, because they do have rights, so we cannot regulate ourselves out of it in a harsh way, but pushing back and informing, I think, and not allowing politicians, and this is, in my view, the crux, is that political speeches are like Twitter. You have 144 characters because that's the attention span we have. So we partly need to have a more dense public discourse and allow it to happen. But how we get there, I have no idea. But it needs to be more informed. As you say, it is actually a matter of information. Once you know that this is a hate group, you act accordingly. And it is a hate group. You don't want anything to do with that. So it takes a lot of time, and it's a lot more demanding on politicians. And it should be hard to be a politician. But it's hard in another way today, I guess.
Okay, thank you. So our time is unfortunately up. Any last comments or remarks? Otherwise, I will say thank you so much to our great panel here, and thank you to the audience, both on Zoom and in person, for brilliant questions and for being here on a Tuesday afternoon with us. Thank you.